from the financial capital of the world. The opening bell is going to ring in 5 seconds, and to be honest with you, we wish it wouldn't.
In response to the great financial crisis of 2008, the United States federal government started engaging in massive fiscal stimulus. Since that time, there have been numerous warnings about the looming problems with the growing debt of the U.S. federal government. Additionally, there's been a growing concern about the alarming status of the unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities. These warnings can be very confusing. It is hard to know what to believe. The following analysis provides a streamlined explanation of the issue. Walt Sosnowski worked in the investment management industry for 25 years, including 17 years as the founder and portfolio manager of SRC Capital Management. Walt graduated from Stanford University in 1987 with a BA in history and received his CFA charter in 1999.
Thanks for joining me for this presentation on the very important topic of our national debt. Over the years, we've all heard numerous warnings about the looming problems with the national debt, and yet others say the debt level doesn't matter, so it can be hard to know what to believe. In order to fully understand the current situation, some historical background is warranted, so let's get started. This first graph is from the period 1792 to 1932. I call this the age of responsibility. The y-axis over on the left is the conventional measure of debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, which is commonly known as GDP. This is used in order to appropriately measure the size of the debt versus the size of the economy over time. Now, coming out of the Revolutionary War, you can see that the U.S. federal government had lots of debt. For those of you who are familiar with the musical Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton was the very first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. Hamilton was instrumental in figuring out how the newly formed American government would honor its wartime debts and then wisely start the process of responsibly paying down those debts. And that's exactly what you can see here. Here's debt to GDP coming out of the Revolutionary War of about 35%. Then, over the next few decades, due to a combination of economic growth and paying down its debts, debt to GDP decreased until that one glorious year of 1835 when the government actually fully paid off all its debt. A very remarkable achievement for a young nation. Then the Civil War hit. This caused the debt to shoot up over 30%. But afterwards, it was followed by yet another long period of financially responsible government where the government was running budget surpluses in some years, small budget deficits in others, and all aided by some nice economic growth. Then World War I hit. This again caused the debt to shoot up over 30%. But afterwards, like before, this was also followed by yet another period of financially responsible government. Stepping back, you can see the big picture pattern for the first 140 years of American history. So far, so good. In fact, this was not just good, it was great. It was stunningly impressive for a new nation. Let's move on. This next chart adds the 30-year period from 1932 to 1962, and you can see that things start to change. You will immediately notice two things. First, World War II was a very expensive war, which caused the debt to spike dramatically over 100%. Second, you will also notice that two other things emerge onto the scene, this yellow area and this orange area. What are they? At this point, I've got some important definitions for you. In the prior chart, the blue area that we have been discussing is properly referred to as federal external debt held by the public. For simplicity, I simply refer to it as debt number one. What does it consist of? This is all the treasury bills, notes, and bonds that are owned by individuals, banks, money market funds, pension funds, central banks, foreign governments, etc. They expect to get paid back. Now let's look at the yellow area. It is formally called intergovernmental holdings. These are basically IOUs that the government has issued to itself. For example, when premiums received for Social Security exceeded disbursements, the excess should have been saved into the trust fund. Instead, the excess was spent, and the government issued an IOU to the so-called trust fund. An analogy is an individual borrowing from one's own 401k plan. Now, if you add these yellow intergovernmental holdings to the blue external debt, the total is what I refer to as debt number 2. The formal name for debt number 2 is total public debt outstanding. By the way, debt number 2 is the figure that is most widely quoted in the media. For example, when you hear something like the federal government debt just hit $34 trillion in some article or a tweet, they're most likely referring to debt number 2. All right, let's keep moving. The orange area is unfunded liabilities, which are mainly unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities. Accountants refer to these as off-balance sheet liabilities. These are future promises the government has made to us citizens without setting aside funds to meet those promises. So now, if you add the orange unfunded liabilities to debt number 2, you get what I refer to as debt number 3. This is a comprehensive measure of all the liabilities of the federal government. I hope this is a helpful framework for you. So now that we have our definitions straight, let's keep moving. This chart takes us all the way up to the present, from 1792 all the way to 2023, which is the last full year of audited government financial statements. We could spend 20 minutes on this graph alone, but let me bring just a couple items to your attention. The first thing you will notice is the enormous size of the orange unfunded liabilities. Here's some quick history for you. When Social Security was originally signed into law back in 1935, it was set up somewhat like an insurance company would do, with American workers paying into the Social Security Trust Fund with the assets saved for future payments. Unfortunately, 4 years later, in 1939, they changed the law and started dipping into the assets of the trust fund. This sort of thinking led to increases in the yellow IOUs and eventually to the orange unfunded liabilities. Another thing you might ask about is the big spike back in 1965. This happened when the Social Security Act of 1965 immediately created some unfunded Medicare liabilities. Now, whether or not there was a better way to set up Social Security and Medicare is another discussion for another day. But whether we like it or not, this is the reality we are now facing as a country. Now, this chart raises a bunch of important questions. At what point is there just too much debt? Is this level of government debt sustainable or not? And what is the level of debt to GDP where problems can start to happen? In order to best answer these questions, let's temporarily back out all the unfunded liabilities and pretend they don't exist. Let's also back out all the intergovernmental holdings or IOUs. Let's only focus on debt number 1, the federal external debt, nothing else. And when you do that, here's what you get. Just like before, on the previous graphs, you will notice all the big wars: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, and the massive spike of World War II. But you also notice 2 new overlays: a yellow warning zone and a red danger zone. So what is the warning zone? It is just what it sounds like. This is the area where our leaders needed to start getting serious about the level of debt. And the danger zone is the area where negative consequences can start to happen, which we'll get to in a moment. All right, to state the obvious, the federal government is in the worst financial shape in its entire history. Even though we have an enormous economy with some terrific companies and some terrific workers producing large tax revenues, the financial situation of the government is not good. At this point, many people start to mentally check out. They don't want to think about this issue. I get it. It isn't a fun thing to admit the country has financial problems. But I'd encourage you to hang in there, as there will be some realistic hope at the end of this presentation. Before discussing the specific consequences of all this debt, as well as the potential solution, I realize some of you might still be a bit skeptical. So before moving on, it is worth addressing a couple questions. Why is 90% the danger zone? Why not higher or lower? While it is difficult to precisely know the debt to GDP ratio that would put the U.S. federal government into danger territory, there is enough historical evidence to make a good estimate. Throughout world history, debt to GDP greater than 90% has been a tipping point that can send a government into problems. Very few countries have successfully sustained over 90% for an extended period without suffering consequences. If you would like more empirical evidence on the topic, you might want to read an excellent book entitled This Time is Different by Reinhardt and Rogoff. The authors have done some excellent work. They analyzed data from 65 countries across 5 continents over 8 centuries. It is very thorough. Now, we can sit around debating the minutia of whether problems can start to happen at 80% or 90% or 100%. But don't miss the big picture. Yes, it is certainly possible that debt problems don't start to happen until levels that are higher than 90%. But why take the risk? Why run the risk of serious problems happening? Okay, let's keep moving. Now that we've established 90% as the level for the danger zone, what about 60% for the warning zone? When the modern European Union was formed and signed the Maastricht Treaty back in 1992, they knew that too much debt could be a problem. Ironically, the treaty prudently set forth the following 2 rules for their member countries. Number 1, annual deficit no greater than 3% of GDP. And number 2, government debt no greater than 60% of GDP. Unfortunately, many of the European nations have violated their own prudent guidelines. But that isn't the point. The point is that they knew that debt to GDP above 60% can be a problem. I agree with them. It is prudent to start the warning zone around 60%. So what about World War II? Debt number 1 got as high as 111% of GDP back during World War II, and the U.S. federal government didn't have a financial crisis then, so why can't the government go to 111% again? That's a legitimate question. First of all, it is possible the government could go that high again without immediately suffering major consequences. Having said that, however, there are a number of important differences between now and then. First, one way or another, World War II was going to end. This was known by investors, citizens, and politicians alike. As soon as the war ended, everyone knew the massive wartime expenditures would end and the debt would stop going up. Today, there is not a clear end to that growing debt. A second important difference is that during World War II, debt number 2 with the IOUs and debt number 3 with all the unfunded liabilities were much lower as a percentage of GDP. Today, the total debt levels, as measured by both debt number 2 and debt number 3, are significantly higher and must be factored in. Finally, there is a third difference that is less quantifiable but just as important. World War II was a serious external threat to America and the free world, so investors and citizens were willing to sacrifice for the common good. Today's financial threat is more self-inflicted, so there is less reasons for investors and citizens to tolerate high levels of debt. Okay, now that we've covered those questions, I'd like to address one more common question. Some claim a country can't default on its debts if it borrows in its own currency. Therefore, the debt doesn't matter. Is that true? The first part is true. The second part is false. Let me explain. If a country borrows in its own currency, it can keep printing money, or said more properly, it can keep creating money electronically, and it won't default on its debts. So that part is true. But that doesn't mean there aren't ramifications. Saying the debt level doesn't matter is simply false. If a country's debt gets too high, even if it can borrow in its own currency, there are still plenty of negative consequences, which will be enumerated shortly. So overall, this claim can be misleading and is sometimes employed as a distraction. It can provide a false sense of security that there won't be any consequences, which just isn't true. Bottom line, the level of debt does matter, even if a country can borrow in its own currency. Okay, now that we've covered all those questions, let's keep moving. So who cares about this danger zone? Are there really any negative consequences? If so, what are they? Let's walk through the potential negative consequences. The first is the crowding out effect. This just means a greater percentage of the federal budget is now required to pay interest on the massive debt rather than going toward other budget line items. Let me get specific with you. In fiscal 2021, the interest on the national debt was $392 billion. This year, in 2024, the interest is projected to be over $900 billion. That is $900 billion that can't be spent on other things. The second consequence is the increased risk of inflation. It isn't pleasant when you have to pay more for everything, especially if your income isn't going up commensurately. Inflation hurts people. Sure, if you're very wealthy, inflation may not be that big a deal. But most Americans have had a taste of inflation the last few years and don't like it one bit. Next is the risk of higher interest rates. If you don't have a need to borrow money, this may not be a big deal. But for those individuals and businesses that do need to borrow money, it is a big deal. And it can also slow down the economy in general, which affects even those that don't need to borrow. The next risk is the increased risk to national security. I truly hope there isn't a big war anytime soon, but if there ever were to be a big war again, it is much more advantageous to enter that war with a lower amount of debt. For example, entering World War I and World War II, the United States was well below a debt ratio of 40%, which allowed for the necessary wartime spending. Unfortunately, the same can't be said today. The next risk is to Social Security and Medicare. Let me be very careful and very clear with this one. Both Democrats and Republicans have clearly stated they do not want any cuts to Social Security and Medicare. So that isn't the issue. Instead, the issue is that these programs are threatened by the enormous interest payments from the massive debt. As citizens, we don't want these programs threatened. The next risk is to the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. For those of you who aren't familiar, the term reserve currency is just the fancy way of saying the most important currency in the world that is most used in trade and most used as a reserve for commercial banks and central banks around the world. Being the world's reserve currency has lots of benefits to the United States. It would be painful to see that lost or diminished. If this were lost, it would significantly decrease America's prestige and influence around the world, with the potential to be one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes in American history. The next is the risk of a severe recession. Depending upon the required policy response from decision makers, a nasty deflationary recession is also a possibility, which could include significant unemployment and bankruptcies. The next is the risk of social unrest. I truly hope this is a lower type of risk, but it is a possibility if many of the other things mentioned above start to happen. The next risk is a reduction in investor confidence. This can mean all sorts of investors: bond market investors, stock market investors, corporate project investors, real estate investors, etc. Finally, there are some additional risks and uncertainties beyond those mentioned here, but that should be enough to get your attention. All right, let's step back and reflect. These are some very significant consequences. We need to take them seriously. So when will these consequences start to happen? What's the time frame? Well, it is hard to say with certainty, but in the last couple of years, some of these consequences have already started to emerge. This should be a big warning. Now, trying to predict the exact timing of these consequences is nearly impossible. There can often be a delay to these consequences due to inertia and recency bias. But even if some of these consequences don't kick in until higher levels of debt, why take that chance? Why play with fire? Wouldn't it be better if we could get our debt to GDP moving in the right direction again? Okay, by now I suspect many of you are asking, what's the solution? So let's carefully wade into that. Let's face it, a political solution will be very difficult. As with any big political problem in our country, the first response is typically to procrastinate and not ruffle any feathers and simply hope it goes away. That is not an effective strategy anymore. There is still some hope, however. While there are not any easy ways to fix this, there are plenty of potential solutions. But the solutions will call for extraordinary political skill and statesmanship. Meanwhile, the Constitution has a number of clues on how to fix this. We don't have time to go into all the details now, but the clues are there. Now, many people think that the president and the executive branch can just unilaterally fix this. That is not the case. While the president does have a strong voice in the matter, it is ultimately up to Congress and the legislative branch to work with the executive branch to solve this problem. Since 1776, America has had a great history of dealing with problems, and we can rise to the occasion again. America is resilient and full of talented people. We have a terrific history of smart and brave people working together to overcome obstacles. We can solve this if we put our mind to it. Okay, so yes, a political solution is going to be extremely difficult. But where do we start? We have to start someplace. The very first step is for a majority of key leaders in the country to actually understand the problem. If you don't understand the problem, you can't fix it. Of course, this includes not only a majority of political leaders, but it also includes a majority of business leaders, a majority of religious and cultural leaders, and a majority of media and educational leaders. And with political leaders, it means not only political leaders at the federal level, but also at the state level. Until a majority of key leaders understand this problem, however, there is little chance of meaningful problem solving on this topic. There is no use skipping the first step and trying to go on to other steps. So for now, the main focus is to simply help leaders understand the situation. Once step one is completed, then it will be time to move forward with proposing and evaluating specific solutions. And then there will be reason for hope and optimism. As I said, America has a great history of dealing with problems, and we can rise to the occasion again. Just as previous generations rose to the challenges of their day, now it is our time to do so. If you would like more information about this topic, a more extensive version of this presentation is available. In addition to graphs and analysis, it also includes detailed spreadsheets of the federal government's historical financial statements for the last 20 years. This includes condensed balance sheets, condensed income statements, and condensed cash flow statements, so that you can actually see the real numbers over time. Finally, there have been a number of smart people that have done some great work over the years on this issue. And to them, I say thank you for all your hard work. I truly hope you now feel more informed about this key issue. Thank you for taking the time to listen.